Once upon a time, there was a place to live the most amazing adventures you've ever dreamed of. A place for fantasy. Inhabited by
David Hockney and the physicist Charles Falco suggested that huge developments in Renaissance art were not just down to people getting better at it, but rather their use of a piece of radically new optical technology known as the camera obscura. Camera obscura is Latin for dark room, and by about 1550, a lens was being used instead of the pinhole, giving a much brighter image, a picture clear enough to trace around. The camera obscura became a portable device, and wily Renaissance artists made them into tents and later boxes that they could climb into. Then a miniature one was developed, which looks surprisingly similar to the cameras that came along 400 years later. Hockney and Falco claim this explains the sudden improvement in realism. But what do you think?
Discovery that if you poke a hole in the wall of a dark room, you create camera obscura. Light passing through the hole is projected upside down and retains color and perspective. The first historical mentions of camera obscura in pinhole photography are by ancient philosophers Mouzy, Aristotle, and Alhazen. In 1490, Leonardo da Vinci records detailed descriptions of camera obscura and uses it to trace stuff. By the 1700s, camera obscura devices are common, and there's evidence to suggest artists like Rembrandt, Vermeer, and Caravaggio used them. Sketchy. In 1724, Johann Heinrich Schulze discovers that substances mixed with silver nitrate react to light. Sadly, the images fade soon after. Until one day in 1826, the world's first photograph is taken by Joseph Nicephore Niepce in France using a procedure called heliography. Voila! This exposure takes several days, and you can see the sun lights up both sides of the building. After his death, Niepce's partner Louis Daguerre continues his work and creates the first practical photographic process in 1833, the daguerreotype. In 1839, the French government buys and declares the daguerreotype free to the world. This is when cool stuff starts happening. Like the first photo of a human. Although this exposure lasted around 7 minutes, a man was getting his shoes polished and was standing perfectly still, thus making history. This was also the first photo with soul. And of course, the world's first selfie is taken by a guy named Robert Cornelius. And human's gonna human. It wouldn't take long for nude photography to kick off too. In 1840, Henry Fox Talbot unveils the calotype, a process based on negatives that allows for paper copies to be made. However, Talbot tried to charge license fees for the calotype, so it didn't really catch on. Compared to Daguerre, whose name is now one of 72 names inscribed on the Eiffel Tower, Talbot spent his life fighting lawsuits and eventually gave up on photography. You could say Talbot became a bit negative in the end. It's also important to mention the contribution of Sir John Herschel, who published many essential research papers and coined the term photography, from the Greek words of light and drawing. By the 1850s, mobile photo studios were all the rage because photos had to be developed on site. Exposure times were about 3 minutes long, so people used neck braces and drugs to keep still. It's also why nobody smiled in early photos. What could be the world's first Photoshop occurs in 1861. The head of Abraham Lincoln is placed on a more noble body. The world's first color photograph is also produced. It's of a bow. In 1871, Richard Leach Maddox, who had an outstanding mustache, invents the gelatin dry plate. This means smaller cameras and no tripods necessary. Great success, old chap. Now, here's a cool story, bro. In order to settle the debate of whether all 4 of a horse's hooves ever simultaneously leave the ground, Englishman Edward Muybridge sets up 12 cameras with wire triggers in the path of a galloping horse. The world's first photo sequence proves that they do. In 1885, George Eastman, founder of Eastman Kodak, invents roll film. The first handheld camera, the Kodak, goes on sale in 1888. Why Kodak? Because Eastman just liked the letter K. The Kodak came preloaded with 100 exposures that needed to be sent back to the factory for processing and reloading when the roll was finished. Eastman takes mass-market photography a step further in the early 1900s with the Brownie, an affordable box camera that introduces the concept of the snapshot. Light's employee Oscar Barnack builds the revolutionary 35mm Leica 1, which goes into production in 1925. The camera allows photographers to go mobile and capture the moment. Some of the most iconic images in history would later be taken on Leicas. The first single-lens reflex SLR camera arrives in 1949. And the first digital image is created from a scan in 1957. However, digital cameras would only arrive a little later, in 1975, when Steve Sasson, a young engineer working for Eastman Kodak, invents the first digital camera. But nobody at Kodak is interested in digital. Who wants to see their photos on a TV? Why change the profitable film photography formula? Too late. Kodak only later switches to digital in 2004 and files for bankruptcy in 2012. The digital revolution begins in the 90s. DSLRs, point-and-shoots. Photography had never been more accessible. Well, until the first mobile phone with a camera came out in 2000. Game changer. 15 years later, and modern smartphones now have insanely powerful cameras. In just seconds, we are able to capture every moment and share it online. Photography has become a global passion and has truly brought the world.
It's estimated that 1.4 trillion photos have been taken in 2020.
Let's now look at 3 fundamental components within the camera that aid in converting these light rays into a photo. These are the aperture, the shutter, and the sensor. Let's first look at the aperture, which is found inside the lens.
The lens has discs called lenses that refract the light rays entering the camera to focus them into a focal point.
The aperture in a DSLR is a spiraled assembly of tiny leaves that open and close together. The amount that the aperture is open is referred to as stops. If the aperture is nearly closed, this is a high f-stop. If the aperture is open, this is a low f-stop. Put the lens back together and follow the path of light into the camera. After the lens, we have the mirror box and a few other key components. This is the heart of a DSLR. The mirror box contains the mirror and the shutter. Behind the mirror box, we have the image sensor, and the pentaprism sits on top. When light enters the mirror box, it's reflected off the main mirror and into the pentaprism. This is the sole purpose of the mirror. When the light enters the pentaprism, it is reflected into the viewfinder, thus allowing the photographer to view down the lens to align the camera for a photo. If we begin the sequence of taking a photo, the mirror flips up and no longer reflects the light rays. The light rays then hit the shutter box. The shutter box is made of 2 curtains, each made up of multiple leaves. When a photo is being taken, the lower curtain drops, letting light through to the sensor. Once the sensor has been exposed for the desired time, the top curtain closes over the sensor, blocking out light once again. The duration that the sensor is exposed to light is referred to as the shutter speed. The shutter speed can range from multiple seconds by just staying open like this, to a thousandth of a second by working together like this. Notice the use of 2 curtains allows every part of the sensor to be exposed to light for the same amount of time. Here's a demonstration of the mirror and the shutter working together to take a photo. The mirror flips out of the way, the shutter opens, and then closes. Now that our sensor has been exposed to light, let's take a closer look to understand how it captures the light to later be turned into a photo. The sensor is made up of millions of pixels. A 16-megapixel camera.
There's a radical shift happening in the world of photography today. Photographers everywhere are slowly transitioning from using the traditional DSLR cameras to the modern mirrorless cameras. While this transition may not be as sensational as the shift from film to digital photography, it is every bit as significant and exciting. What is a mirrorless camera? Mirrorless cameras are cameras that have an electronic viewfinder, instead of an optical viewfinder found in DSLRs. The optical viewfinder in a DSLR uses a system of internal mirrors that allows you to see the scene you're photographing directly through the lens. This is how it works. First, the light enters the lens and hits a mirror reflecting it into a prism. Then, the prism reflects the light into a viewfinder, allowing you to see the scene. In contrast, a mirrorless camera allows light to pass through the lens directly onto the image sensor. The optical viewfinder is replaced with an electronic viewfinder that displays what the image sensor sees. In DSLRs, pressing and releasing the shutter button triggers the reflex mirror to flip up and the shutter to open, allowing the light to hit the camera sensor and record an image. Mirrorless cameras, on the other hand, use either a mechanical shutter, which is the default setting, or an electronic shutter. The mechanical shutter setting uses physical shutters to initiate the exposure. It starts with the shutter being out of sight, allowing the sensor to record the scene and transmit it to the viewfinder. When you press the shutter button, the top shutter will momentarily close, then open to expose the sensor for the duration of the shutter speed. Once open, the bottom shutter will close to end the exposure. In contrast, the electronic shutter does not use any physical movements to initiate the exposure. Rather, it relies on activating and deactivating the sensor to capture the image. Are mirrorless cameras better than DSLRs? Mirrorless cameras have many advantages over traditional DSLR cameras. Since mirrorless cameras don't use mirrors or a pentaprism, their bodies can be made more compact and lightweight compared to most DSLR cameras. The electronic viewfinder also enables you to preview live changes to your histogram and camera settings, such as exposure settings, saturation, and white balance. In addition, mirrorless cameras feature contrast detect autofocus and focus peaking, which makes focusing easier and faster on static objects. Mirrorless cameras do have two main disadvantages compared to DSLRs. The first is they have smaller batteries with less storage capacity. This shortened battery life is exacerbated by the fact that the camera needs to be turned on to be able to see through the electronic viewfinder. Mirrorless cameras are also generally more expensive than DSLRs. But with all the unique features, they are undoubtedly a worthwhile investment. Overall, mirrorless cameras are capable of matching, if not outperforming, DSLRs in almost everything, from image quality, video quality, and speed.
ෆොටෝග්‍රැෆි කියන්නේ වයස් භේදයක් නැතිව හැම පුද්ගලයෙකුටම පටන් ගන්න පුළුවන් විනෝදාංශයක්. ෆොටෝග්‍රැෆි විනෝදාංශයක් විදිහට පටන් අරගෙන අද වෙනකොට ලොකු ගණනකින් සිසුන්
චූටි කැකුලා මලු පොජ්ජේ මක්කේ
මලු පොජ්ජේ පැණි පොජ්ජේ
ෆොටෝ පොජ්ජක් ගමුද එහෙනම් දුනු පොජ්ජත් එක්ක පොරෝ පොජ්ජත් එක්ක
ඔය රූපතන පතාරින යමකේ කොයි බින්ද මන්ද කරගත්තේ ඔය කැමරා පොජ්ජ කොයි බින්ද මන්ද කරේ කැමරාල්ගේ පේනව නේද කැමරාල්ගේ කියපු ගමන් එයත් සතුටුයි ඔයත් සතුටුයි ලකුණු ආසියාවේ ලොකුම කැමරා මාකට් එක එක්ක ෂොප් එකට නැත්නම් වෙබ් එකට cameraLK.com